everyone. I'm Connie McVicker, and I'm a board member at Bethel. And I would like to share with you our devotional for today, which is taken from 1 Thessalonians 5:16, and it's just 2 words: rejoice always. Now, you might say that's hard, considering all the circumstances that we face today and have for the last year and a half, with the COVID restrictions, the government's going haywire, and excelling world events. Many suffer, even Christians, from uncertainty, anxiety, fear, loneliness, depression, and grief. All these things can certainly take our joy away, but for God. But how can we keep our joy? Let's look to 1 Thessalonians 5:17. Pray continually. And then verse 18. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you. The quote that goes with our scripture today says, God has made every day, and he called it good. There are blessings to enjoy, challenges to face, and opportunities to grow. Start this day with the joy that the Lord is God over this very day, and his purposes are good. Let's pray. Thank you, God, that you are there for us every day and in every circumstance. Remind us to receive your joy that only you can give, and help us to share it with others. Amen. May God bless you today and all the days to come.
As Christians, when people bring up the topic of evangelism, what do you think that means? Well, in my experience, people usually end up in one of 2 camps. Camp 1 says you need to talk about Jesus and live a life that's consistent with what you believe, and Camp 2 says all you have to do is live a good life. It'll speak for itself. Well, first of all, it's a big jump to assume that anyone can live a good life, don't you think? I mean, Romans 3:10 through 11 says, none is righteous, no, not one. No one does good, not even one. But that doesn't convince you. In Mark 10, a man comes up to Jesus and kneels down before him and says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus responds promptly with, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. Now, not only was Jesus subtly claiming to be God here, he's making it pretty clear that nobody is good except for him, hence the no one is good part. But this is the sideshow to the main event, folks, so step right up and let's get down to it. And let's assume when Camp 2 says good life, they just mean if you live a visible, godly life, people will, just by watching you, understand all they need to know about God. Okay, let's play that out, shall we? And let's ask Bruce if he can help us. Hey, Bruce, hey. So Bruce grabs a Mormon, a Jehovah's Witness, and a Christian, and he tells you to follow each of those folks around, and after simply watching them, you'll know all you need to know about God. Now, each goes to a place every week and sits among like-minded folks. Each person prays, each treats you with respect, each loves his family, is honest with his money, and is basically a nice person. So, which God do you pick based on just watching? Who's right? How do you know? What do you compare unless they tell you why they do what they do? Talking, it seems, becomes critical. No doubt nature reveals much about the invisible attributes of God, but how do you know exactly what he requires of you? I mean, who he really is and what his ultimate plan is without some kind of specific revelation from him? I mean, how would you know if your mother wanted you to paint the left wall of the garage red if it wasn't specifically communicated to you in some way, usually by writing a note or speaking to you? So, what did God deem the best way to communicate the specifics of his will? Did he summon porpoises to do a modern dance? Did he draw word pictures in the clouds? No. To communicate precisely the things he wanted you to know, he intervened throughout history and spoke through men, ultimately moving some of them to write the Bible. That is, he spoke and he wrote a note. How would we know if God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, that Adam and Eve were created in a perfect world, but their rebellion brought sin and death into the world, that it's the grace of God through faith in Jesus alone that saves us? How would you know that Jesus died on the cross and resurrected from the grave? How would you know any detail about God and his word and his plan if nobody told us? Well, we wouldn't. We couldn't. And that's why you got to tell people things. You just can't hope people will catch on by watching you live a so-called good life. It's just not enough. Ultimately, you got to tell them why you live that way. But don't just take my word for it, my inquiring Berean band of misfits. Read along in Romans 10. And how can they know who to trust if they haven't heard of the one who can be trusted? And how can they hear if nobody tells them? Jesus himself definitively declares in Matthew 28, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. It's kind of hard to baptize in the name of somebody without actually saying the name, and it's pretty difficult to teach people to observe commandments without telling them what those commandments are, right? I mean, I could go on until my mouth falls off, but suffice to say, Christians are commanded to live a life worthy of the calling, which irrefutably includes things like giving reasons and answers for our hope and engaging in a conversation about Christ. So this idea that you never have to speak out about your faith and all you have to do is live a good life and people will catch on has been debunked. Adios.
Where together again, just praising the Lord. We're together again in one accord. Something good is about to happen. Something good is in store. We're together again, just praising the Lord. We're together again, just praising the Lord. We're together again in one accord. Something good is about to happen. Something good is in store. We're together again, just praising the Lord. Something good is about to happen. Something
Good morning. My name is Brian Warner, lead pastor of Bethel, and I'm glad that you've joined us today for our online service. You could turn to 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1 to 19. I'll be reading that shortly. The title of my message is Be an Anyone, Anywhere. The scripture goes like this. Now Naaman was the commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read like this. "With this letter I'm sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent this message. "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the river of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you have not done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. And his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is a God in all the world, that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry. For your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." "Go in peace," Elisha said. May God bless the reading of his word. May we get a lot out of this story, and may we find ourselves in the place of this young servant girl who was full of belief and was willing to share it. Now, here's some background. There are 2 nations represented here, Israel and Aram, which was just northeast of Israel. Aram used to pay tribute to David, but have since become more powerful, and they posed a threat to Israel. This hostile neighbor would do raids from time to time and take spoils and slaves, and one of the slave girls finds herself in the house of Naaman. And in this account, the people who get the most attention and interest are Naaman and the Elisha prophet. Great men, opposites, but great men. In this account, we see the mercy of God shown to Naaman. He's a Gentile who was healed miraculously by an unspectacular method of healing, just dipping in dirty water, the River Jordan, for 7 times. We'll look more at his story next week. But what is equally significant about this amazing story is how it got started. It started with a young servant girl, a slave who was taken captive and placed in Naaman's home to care for his wife. And she's the one who made it all happen. She's the one who started it all, who got the ball rolling. Her name isn't given at all. She could have been anyone, and she was. She was just an anyone. And this young girl isn't named, but she is way up there on my list anyways of who's who. She's way up there with Joseph, who went from pit to prison to second in command. You remember his story? He's far away from his family in a strange land, Egypt. But the starting of it was he was sold into slavery by his brothers. Then he faced prison. And then he moved up the ladder. He got God's favor and Pharaoh's favor. And through it all, he remained close to God. He was used by God to save a nation and his family. And all of that was part of God's plan. Then there were the 4 Hebrew boys taken into captivity. You can read their story in Daniel. It's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel. They would not take the king's meat and drink or bow down to a graven image. And even though they were far from home, far from a parent's influence and watchful eyes, they stood their ground. They would not deny their God and maintained their godly character in a godless, strange land. See, who you are when no one knows you but God is important, and you can make a difference. I like the story that the children were lined up in the cafeteria of a Catholic elementary school for lunch. At the head of the table was a large pile of apples. The nun made a note and posted on the apple tray, "Take only one. God is watching." Moving further along the lunch line, at the other end of the table was a large pile of chocolate chip cookies. A child had written a note, "Take all you want. God's watching the apples." You know, God is able to watch the apples and the chocolate chip cookies at the same time. God is all-knowing, and he sees the big picture. Naaman, Elisha, Gehazi, the kings, and this slave girl. She's not forgotten. She's not overlooked by God. It comes down to a relationship that she had. Now, you can take God with you no matter the circumstances or the place or time or times. God is always with you. And the question is, are you always with him? It appears that this slave girl still had her faith intact when she had every reason to throw in the towel. And the best thing to do when it's just you and God in a strange land, unfair circumstances, is to share him, which is exactly what she did. Naaman was a commander of the army. He was a great man. He was highly regarded. He was a valiant soldier, opposite to her in every way. But regardless of his position, how he was ranked in the military, no matter how close he was to the king or how much money he had, his disease outweighed them all. The end of verse 1 says, "But he had leprosy." What a contrast. What a contrast between a man who had everything to a young girl who had nothing. Everything had been taken away from her: home, family. She was not in the country that she loved. Her dreams were taken away, but she still had faith. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, when everything is taken away from us, if that was to happen, what would we have? What would we be holding on to? I hope it's like this slave girl, that we would still have our faith intact. See, the world needs Christians anywhere and everywhere. And here's the good news. Anyone can do what needs to be done anywhere, anytime. That's the lesson that we get from this slave girl in Naaman's household. Well, I want to look at her choices, what she did. She had the means. She was in Naaman's house, a Christian on the inside, if you will. She was a slave far away from home, but she was in the right place according to God's plan. I want to talk about the moment. She seized the moment. She was aware of Naaman's condition, and she waited for an opportune time to share. And then there's the message. She spoke up, and she took the risk of rejection and reprimand because she had something worth everything to share, and that was her faith in God. I want you to consider the means, where you are and who you are. I want you to ask God to give you that moment that you can seize. And then I also want you to ask for the courage by the power of the Holy Spirit to share the message because someone needs to hear it. Not from me, but from you, because you have a relationship. God has placed you in a place, in a family, in a work environment, on a street. He's given you a sphere of influence, and you could take that opportunity. You can be the anyone in this story because God is for you and wants to use you. Well, the amazing thing about this account is that she spoke up. The Bible says she said to her mistress, and that's an important part in the story because she didn't have to say anything. She would have a lot of reasons to do nothing, to say nothing, some of which are, I'm a captive. I've been taken away from my family, my country, everything I loved and held dear. Or this isn't the future I wanted. This is not what I signed up for. It's not my business. Naaman is not my family. He's only my employer. I mean, he has his own religion. He's not even Jewish. Why should I care? Why should I bother? Or my faith is mine. It's personal. I don't need to share it with anyone. Or she could have reveled in his suffering and silently felt justified because of his pain and hopelessness. But she didn't. She even put herself in a position of being ridiculed and belittled by sharing what she did. There was a risk. Her master could have said, listen, you're in my country now. I am your boss. I am a man of power and influence. Where was your God when you needed him? Our nation is greater than Israel. Know your place and be quiet. But she decided to speak up. Remember, God was still with her, and she was still with God. Someone said, few of us are big enough to become little enough to be used by God. I'll just say it one more time. Few of us are big enough to become little enough to be used by God. And she was used in a life-changing way for Naaman. I like the story I read in Our Daily Bread years ago. Actually, it goes back to September 22nd, 2000. And the title was, Do You Love Jesus? The story goes like this. A man was assigned a middle seat on an airplane. Tired and wanting to sleep, he was irritated when the young girl next to him with Down syndrome asked, Mister, do you brush your teeth? Yes, he replied. That's good. People who don't lose their teeth. A little later, she asked, Mister, do you smoke? No, he answered. Well, that's good. People who do die. After a long silence, she turned to him again. Mister, do you love Jesus? Yes, I do, he responded. That's good, she added. People who do go to heaven. Though deeply touched, he settled back, hoping there would be no more questions. Just then the girl said, Mister, ask the man next to you if he brushes his teeth. Well, you can guess what happened. When she came to the question about Jesus, the second man became thoughtful. I'm afraid I don't understand, he said. For the next hour, the two men talked about eternal issues. Sometimes opportunities for sharing God's love may come in unusual ways. But if we are willing, he will bless even our feeblest efforts to tell others that Jesus loved them so much that he died for him. Love that story. Well, the other amazing thing about this account is that Naaman followed her advice. And you have to ask yourself, why would he give any thought to a young Jewish girl, his slave, who is from another religion, not even his own? What was it about her life? She had the answer to Naaman's greatest need. I mean, he had searched everywhere and everyone for a cure, and the answer was right under his nose, in his own house, wrapped up in this slave girl. I believe it was because of her faith, that it was an everyday faith, not just a Sabbath faith. She lived for God 24/7, even in a strange land as a slave. She believed what she shared, and it was evident in how she lived. She even believed it could be true for her enemy, even Naaman. Now that's thinking outside of the box, isn't it? She said, if only he would cure him. That is faith. A little girl changed a great man who was not only healed, but made whole. See, it's not just about the physical need, but the spiritual need that everyone has. Everyone has the same spiritual need to be made whole, to believe in God. And if this slave girl who lost everything except her faith in God could do it, can't we? My challenge to you and a reminder to myself is to be an anybody, anywhere, just like this young slave girl. Each of us can be like her, be an anybody, and have an influence on somebody. You just never know the impact and influence that you'll have until you stand up and speak out. Caring enough to speak up and do something, even when we're just an anybody, anywhere, that can change a life. You don't want to live in a world of what ifs. You want to live in a world of I did. And that's what the slave girl made her mind up. She made a choice. She had the means, she had the message, and she followed through. She seized the moment. Now, if it wasn't for her, the power of a sincere personal testimony in Naaman's life, just think of the what if for a moment. If it wasn't for her, Naaman, without the slave girl, would have remained a leper and died that way. He would have remained an unbeliever and died that way. He would never have renounced the idols of his country or learned to worship the one true God. Now, I want to ask another question. If it wasn't for you, then ... Fill in the blank or finish the sentence. Who in your life is better today because of your testimony, because of your courage to live for God and influence others? Because no matter where you were, you seized the moment, you shared the message, you took that opportunity. Now that's a loaded question. And maybe the answer is no one, at this point anyways. Why don't you pray to God and ask Him to use you, to make a difference wherever you are, in your family, in your workplace, with your friends, or your sphere of influence? Everyone needs someone to share Jesus with them. I read a true story about a lady named Ruby Hamilton, a businesswoman in her 50s. And she was stunned at the loss of her husband of 32 years in a car accident. Her anger and disappointment went deeper than a mere physical expression of grief, though. She had become a follower of Christ in her late 20s, but her husband didn't share her newfound interest in spiritual things. Nonetheless, she had set about praying for him relentlessly and feverishly, unceasingly, that he would come to know the Lord. And one day when she was praying, she felt a wave of peace just wash over her, and that still small voice assuring her that her husband would be okay. She eagerly waited the day when her husband surrendered his life to Jesus. And now this. What do you do when faith doesn't make sense, when God doesn't seem to be answering or opening doors or found? Ruby Hamilton stopped living for God. Here's the second part of the story. Roger Simmons was hitchhiking his way home. He would never forget the date, May 7th. His heavy suitcase was making him tired, and he was anxious to take off that army uniform once and for all. Flashing the thumb to the oncoming car, he lost hope when he saw it was a black, sleek, new Cadillac. To his surprise, the car stopped. The passenger door swung open. He ran to the car, tossed his suitcase in the back, and thanked the handsome, well-dressed man as he slid into the front seat. Going home for keeps? Sure am. Well, you're in luck if you're going to Chicago. Not quite that far. Do you live in Chicago? I have a business there, the driver said. My name is Hamilton. They chatted for a while, and then Roger, a Christian, felt a compulsion to share his faith with his 50-ish, apparently successful businessman. But he kept putting it off till he realized now that he was just 30 minutes from his home. It was now or never. Mr. Hamilton, I would like to talk to you about something very important. Then he simply told Mr. Hamilton about the plan of salvation and ultimately asked him if he would like to receive Jesus as his Lord and Savior. The Cadillac pulled over to the side of the road. Roger expected that he was about to get thrown out of the car. Instead, the businessman bowed his head and received Christ. Then thanked Roger. "This is the greatest thing that ever happened to me." Well, 5 years went by. Roger married, had a couple of kids, and a business of his own. Packing his suitcase for a trip to Chicago, he found a small white business card that had been given to him by Hamilton 5 years previous. In Chicago, he looked up Hamilton Enterprises. The receptionist told him that it was impossible to see Mr. Hamilton, but he could see his wife, Mrs. Hamilton. A little confused, he was ushered into a beautiful office where he found himself facing a keen-eyed woman in her 50s. She extended her hand. "You knew my husband?" Roger told her about how Hamilton had picked him up while he was hitchhiking home after the war. "Can you tell me what that day was?" "Sure, it was May 7th, 5 years ago, the day I was discharged from the army." "Anything special about that day?" she asked. He hesitated, not knowing if he should mention how he shared the message of Jesus with her husband. "Mrs. Hamilton, I explained the gospel to your husband that day. He pulled over to the side of the road and wept against the steering wheel. He gave his life to Christ that day." Well, explosive sobs shook her body. Finally getting a grip on herself, she sobbed, "I had prayed for my husband's salvation for years. I believed God would save him." "Where's your husband, Ruby?" "He's dead. He was in a car crash after you let him out of the car. He never got home. You see, I thought God had not kept his promise. I stopped living for God 5 years ago. I thought that God had not kept his word." What an amazing story of Roger being the right person at the right time, doing the right thing. And this guy, Hamilton, coming to a saving knowledge. And his wife's prayers answered. Only God knows how to put everything together, even if there's time in between, like this story. Don't give up. God is with you. Are you with God? No matter the circumstances of life, where you may find yourself, and what you have to deal with. Let me just wrap this up. For Naaman, that must have been quite the trip home and quite the reunion with the slave girl. I'm sure that he had an amazing conversation. She was part of the good news right from the very beginning. Now, I wonder what she thought when he came back with a load of dirt. That'll have to be a question I ask when I get to heaven. That must have been quite the conversation. And the most important thing is not that he was made physically whole, but that he was whole on the inside. He knew the one true God. My question is, do you? God often uses unlikely messengers to spread the gospel of his power, and he could do amazing things in our lives. She was willing to point Naaman to the one and only true God. And for her, whatever the circumstances, she would serve the Lord. For you, whatever your circumstances, are you serving the Lord? We have something to say. We have a life to live, and it's not for ourselves, but it's for God to make our faith believable. We may find ourselves in situations as if a slave, this slave girl, where there's no breathing room or elbow room, no promising future, where it would be the easiest thing to be bitter and mad at God. But we too can be used by God in any situation. I like this poem that I close with. One day I looked at myself, at the self that Christ can see. I saw the person I am today and the one I ought to be. I saw how little I really pray and how little I really do. I saw the influence of my life, how little of it was true. I saw the bundle of faults and fears I ought to lay on the shelf. I had given a little bit to God, but I hadn't given myself. I came from seeing myself with my mind made up to be the sort of person that Christ can use with a heart that he may always see. Few of us are big enough to become little enough to be used of God. Would you be that anyone, anywhere that God can use? If you would bow your heads in prayer, this is going to be a really short prayer, but I pray that it'll be personal and that it would be powerful and life-changing for you, that God could use you, but also life-changing for someone else. It goes like this. God, help me to be big enough to become little enough to be used by you. And this I ask in Jesus' name. Amen.